All right. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce you for today's program. We're going to get started. And as you know, you're joining a program organized by Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. My name is Marie-Christine Mitzi. I'm the president of Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. And we're joining today to discuss a topic that we have seen a lot in our newsfeed recently, the concept of quiet quitting. Today's event will last an hour, and we are currently recording for our members who are in different time zones and may join us by watching the recording asynchronously at a time that fits their time zone better. You have probably seen this concept of quiet quitting in your newsfeed quite a lot in the recent weeks. On the heels of the Great Resignation, it's a new term that claims to capture a radical shift in our relationship with work. However, it is not a transparent concept, and there seems to be both diverse perspectives and even some controversy around this term and what it actually means. Today, to help us think more deeply about the concept of quiet quitting, I am joined by two speakers, Dr. Lee and Alina Silyuk. Dr. Julie Lee is a clinical psychologist and the director of technology and mental health at Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. She is a clinical psychologist, a faculty, and a digital mental health strategist. Dr. Lee provides individual and organizational level support to improve mental health, engagement, and wellness in the educational, tech, and health sectors. Her approach to people, culture, and the workplace has been implemented by Fortune 500 companies, including EMC, Boston Scientific, Deutsche Bank, and Verizon. In private practice, Dr. Lee provides leadership coaching and psychotherapy to executives, physicians, and entrepreneurs. Welcome, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And joining us today is Alina Silyuk, a business correspondent at NPR, where she covers retail, low-wage work, big brands, and other aspects of the consumer economy. Her work has been recognized by the Gracie Awards, the National Headliner Award, and the Society of American Business Editors and Writers. Before joining NPR in 2015, Alina spent 5 years at Reuters, where she covered tech, telecom, cybersecurity, and campaign finance during the 2012 election cycle. Her work also appeared on CNN, ABC News, National Journal, The Atlantic, and the New York Times. Welcome, Alina. Thank you for joining us today.
And the technical problems begin. Thanks.
So with this hot topic for us to discuss, we thought that we were going to start directly with the beginning, which is, what is quiet quitting? Can we come to a consensus on what this truly means? Is it just a new name to an old phenomenon? Is it even real? Maybe, Alina, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, definitely. I have referred to quiet quitting just sort of in my own personal life as the term quiet quitting as a Rorschach test, because I feel like it just inspires very different reactions just depending on what your own personal perception is of the power dynamics in the workplace, whether it means people are just kind of slacking off, or whether it means people are taking a stand and carving out their own mental health spaces within their work. Or another metaphor I've used is to compare it to that big internet controversy over the black and blue dress versus white and gold, right? It just depends on the perspective with which you come to it, what it means to you, or whether you're critical of it, or whether you think it's real. To be clear, the data that gets cited most often on this matter is a Gallup poll that shows nearly half of American workers feeling disengaged, not so engaged at work, which is a really high number. But to put it into perspective, that number has been high for decades. And in fact, most people consider this kind of question of whether you feel engaged at work, how people say no to that answer is a bit of a chronic condition based on that polling itself. So it's definitely sort of a new term to help people comprehend a new version of this long-running trend.
Yeah, I'm imagining you're alluding to a different context over the past 2 years. Julie, do you also see that trend changing or being shaped by the context where emerging is maybe even controversial, or at least we're still on after the previous 2 years that we've gone through COVID-19?
Right. No, I think that's a really important point for us to contextualize where we are as a society and collect to understand why perhaps the phenomenon that is not entirely new has taken a life of its own. I think, as you alluded, uh, we have really endured very difficult and challenging transitions and losses and really shift in our personal and professional life since the start of the pandemic. So I think it's important for us to reflect upon the fact that I think many of us have started to really question, what is important for us in relation to work, what's important for us generally, especially as many of us have had family members and loved ones impacted or even lost them to COVID. I think another contextual element to note is that I think people are starting to really question the
Mhm.
security of their positions at their employer. I think when some of the companies start to downsize, some of those stellar workers realized that there was no sense of safety net, despite the fact that they had invested a great deal into their work. So I think that also precipitated a kind of reflective moment for people to ask, what role does work play in my personal life?
Right, this idea that you could be a stellar employee and give it your all and then be sacked with no second thought. I see. What I'm curious if you can shed a little bit of light based on what you've read and your own perspective about what quiet quitting means from the perspective of the employee. Is it quitting? Is it just doing your job? Julie, there seems to be a lot of ambivalence there.
Yeah, I think that's the question of the afternoon, and I appreciate Alina making a reference to a psychological test, the Rorschach. I think all of us bring our own questions and experience to this term. So I think it's really nuanced and complex, and it's really hard for us to say, what it means to everyone, because I think it does mean something different. I think for some people who have invested and who have spent, access extensive hours outside of what is expected of their job description, for them it would mean something very different than for people who are finding their work to be not meaningful and engaged. But I think one thing that is important is that when we hear the quiet quitting, it's easy to make or jump to the conclusion that people are kind of stepping back from work and spending their time on their couch, so to speak. But I don't think that is what's happening. In my conversation with the clients that I work with, the people who are starting their own entrepreneurial ventures, I think people are actually taking a stock of how they're spending their time, both in and outside of work, and actually making some intentional decisions about where they want to put their time and energy. I think second point I want to raise is related to this question of engagement. I think Gallup, we're going to make a lot of reference to Gallup poll. Gallup poll has said that about 70% of engagement is actually predicated on how they about their manager. That's an astonishingly high percentage. That does put a lot of responsibility on the managers who also had to manage abrupt transition to remote and many to hybrid. Having said that, when we kind of step back and think about all the changes that we have undergone, and that relationship and a sense of engagement of manager is so important, we navigate a transition to hybrid work, I think it's important for us to ask a question related to, what are workplaces doing in order to really adjust to COVID at post-COVID workplace? Are they doing enough to cultivate a sense of belonging, a sense of engagement, and sense of being a part of greater mission for the company?
So that moment we're in might really challenge companies to evolve in their practices, evolve how they engage their workers. Alina, with your broader lens and having reported in different times in history, do you also feel there is something specific happening now? Help us understand the dynamics here at play.
Yeah, we've definitely, I mean, I feel like now in year 3 of talking about unprecedented changes to the American workplace. And yeah, it's true in a different way. And so there's so many different things that have changed with the remote work and the, you know, completely.
I'll go with you for the.
Could someone mute whoever's, or we can hear your phone conversation. I don't think you want us to be listening in on your chats. Yeah, so the latest change, like the latest trend is, you know, a lot more companies are trying to reassess whether they can bring back their workers to the workplace, and workers are sort of in many places are rebelling. And we're in this particular context, I'm talking about most office workers. In the past year, we also saw a massive sort of revisitation of what it means to be a low-wage frontline worker in America, right? Folks who work in grocery stores and restaurants really having to come to terms with the fact that they were thrown into the sort of customer-facing jobs during the pandemic that was so threatening to their livelihood. All of this is to say that we're in this moment. I mean, we talked a long time about the Great Resignation and this concept of people just not wanting to work, quitting their jobs. And that's sort of the data that started floating around, that started a bit of a misnomer conversation about that, because the data that we're seeing is, in fact, for the past year, every month a record number of workers quits their jobs. I think it's been 4 million workers quitting their jobs every month for going on a year now. It's astonishing number of workers, except for the fact that it's easy to conclude that they're not going, you know, they're just not working. They don't want to work. Well, in reality, they're taking better jobs or they're relocating. So people aren't, the vast majority of those people are not quitting to retire. They're quitting to take a better job or a different job. And there's a lot of job hopping happening, which really shifts the dynamic where the companies have to work harder to attract workers, whether it's with higher pay, with better benefits, or with better flexibility to have passions on the side, pursue hobbies, that sort of thing. We're seeing a lot of that happening. And I think this concept of quiet quitting is sort of like a flip side of the Great Resignation, all these, right? But it's sort of like a flip side for people who are choosing, maybe they cannot quit their job or they don't want to quit their job, but they're reevaluating the amount of energy they invest in that job, or just emotional energy, even if not physical energy. Because workers I've been talking to, most of the people who I've talked to who have quit will say things like, I'm not grading papers on the weekends, right? I'm grading papers during work hours. As a teacher, I am a dental assistant who is now being asked to do a bunch of administrative work. That's not my job. In the past, I would have done it because I really needed that. Like, now I know that I'm extremely valuable and they're trusting me. And so I'm just going to say at 5 o'clock, I get out. And if that administrative work didn't get done, I did my job. I'm a dental assistant. It's that kind of change.
Thank you both. And I think you've alluded, both of you, in little touches to the fact that there might also be a different culture that may be informed by different generations of workers, right? This idea of, well, you haven't done the work until everything is done, no matter if tasks are added that were not in your job description, versus, well, no, I have satisfied all of the conditions because I'm meeting what was in the job description. And we've definitely seen headlines in the news attributing different qualities to different generations of workers. You know, recently working with Gen Zs is like working with people from a different culture, different country, right? So what's your take on this? Do you see it as a generational trend? Is it something that's here to stay? Alina, what's your take on this?
Well, to go back to that Gallup that started it all, that shows disengagement of workers sort of inching up over the past few years. like I said, only in historic terms, it's not showing a huge overall change in disengagement of workers, but the one category where it does show a fairly big shift is the younger workers under 30. And that's, I think, what a lot of people have sort of seen through the TikTok, the virality aspect of this story. We at NPR did very unscientific survey where we just solicited answers to a bunch of questions about quiet quitting to our audience, and it's spread quite widely on social media. We got over 900, I think almost 1,000 answers. And reading those answers, our audience kind of, runs the gamut of ages. The answers we got were a lot from older workers, not Gen Z only, but millennial, a lot of millennials, a lot of Gen X, and some boomers. And a few folks I've spoken with who are older, they said that it definitely started with like their younger coworkers talking about it, and then them kind of going, wait a minute, this is how things have always been. And I sort of assume things will always be this way, but why is it that we're expected to? So it's it's driven by the younger workers perhaps, but it's certainly having an impact far beyond that.
Thank you. Julie, do you also see that impact on your work with millennials?
Absolutely. Both millennials and, Gen Z. So if we're talking about workers under age of, 30, we're talking about, older Gen Zs right now. Sort of that cap is, age 26 and millennials. So in many ways, I think I agree with Alina that the Gen Zs who have entered the workforce in the last, 4 or 5 years, of course, the last 2.5 years of their work life having taken place during the pandemic, and we have to also recognize they're entering workforce in a transformative time in their life under very unusual circumstances. So I think they're actually bringing the question about their work and value of work, I think, in a different way that I think many of us who are not in that bracket. I think for us, there was sort of an expected transition from college to work for those of us who took that pathway, or high school to work. And there weren't disruptive forces that I think the Gen Zs and millennials have had to that brought these questions to mind. I think it's really, I work extensively with Gen Z's populations, and I have a lot of admiration for their passion and their willingness to really question the status quo. And I think, there's also some quite a bit written about the conflict and differences between generations. And, sometimes the Gen Zs are characterized as privileged or naive, maybe entitled or unrealistic in their views. Really sure those descriptors are accurate. I think, in fact, they're really contending with what is important for them in the context of a very difficult period of their formative years, and bring these questions about work life and the integration of work and life to the forefront of their decision-making process. And I do believe they're actually to impact, they have already started to, and I think they're starting to impact the future of work. Just this morning, I was in a different work meeting, and at the end of the business meeting, the conversation said it's extremely hard to hire young professionals unless you offer a remote option. So they were actually having a conversation related to just what we're talking about. And they said, the pay is not necessarily the most important factor for Gen Zs and young millennials in choosing their work. Matter of fact, it shows that they want a workplace that is aligned with their personal values, where they offer benefits that is allow them to have a work-life balance and mental health and wellness resources. And they also want to have an opportunity for growth and learning. I think those are 3 things that have consistently been noted as being of importance to Gen Zs and millennials.
Can I add something? occurred to me. I think this is yet another example too of how this is very much a Rorschach test, because if you want to focus on Gen Zers, this is the explanation. If you want to focus on millennials, there's a really also logical explanation too, that millennials are now sort of reaching middle age, right? We are having kids, we're having older parents who need care, we're having all of these life events, also the pandemic, in really reevaluating how much time you spend on your family, all of that. And with all of that, millennials are now the largest chunk of the workforce, right? So that in itself could be driving this quiet quitting conversation. And then when you start looking at older generations, there's that whole point of like the pandemic reminded them of all of the hobbies that they missed out on, or all of the other exciting things that they doing with their time when they're at home as opposed to at work. So they're starting to draw more stricter boundaries around their work. So depending on sort of which category you're looking at, you could come up with explanations going on.
It might be the case that there's a convergence right now, and that different generations through their own lenses and at different phases of their lives end up asking similar questions about the place of work in their life and also the different values. Julie, Alina, you seem to agree as well, right? These values of it, the bottom line and the six figure is no longer sufficient to keep those workers in their roles. They're getting frustrated with a role where they cannot grow. They're getting irritated to be in a role where they don't necessarily see the impact and the value, the alignment with those core values that you were discussing. It's definitely something that we hear a lot from a number of quiet quitters. And I also wonder in the fact that there are now different generations in the workplace, maybe changing the dialogue, changing the criteria, right? It's possible that maybe this attitude was not fit to the workplace as it was a number of years ago, and the workplace is shifting such that these requests, these demands are now part of the shaping of the workplace. I'm wondering if there is also a different point of comparison, a different perspective that comes from a cross-cultural perspective. We have a lot of workers who are in contact with other family relatives who operate in different cultural contexts. And I wanted to share one anecdote from a friend of mine who's working in France and who was welcoming a new worker in the company and in the team. And the worker coming from the US stayed overnight, stayed on the weekend to be fully dedicated to the job, and on Monday morning was kind of expecting an accolade and saying that he had stayed throughout the weekend. He's so committed to this new role, and was pretty surprised to be faced with the feedback of, do you need help with time management? Do you need more training? What's going on? Why can't you do your work in the 35-hour work week, let alone the 40-hour work week we have in the US? I'm curious if you could think about how these different cultures around the world of relation to work can impact the dialogue today in the US.
Yeah, I really appreciated that example when Dr. Neal shared that with me, because I think that really is a great example of how the policies and expectations and cultural components have always influenced how we conceptualize our work life and what's expected and what we aspired, and what was seen as sort of being a good worker. I think example that I wanted to share was, that of Japan. I think Japan is known as one of the countries where there is a very intense work life, expectations, and people working many hours above and beyond 35 hours a week. So in fact, until 2018, the government found that only about 50% of Japanese workers were taking their allocated paid time off, i.e. the vacation time. It became very concerned. And when people asked, they were asked why they're not taking time off, most workers said, well, it's hard for me to take time off when my boss has not taken a time off. People were taking literally 2 or 3 days max a year if they were in, but kind of intense and demanding work settings. So in fact, the government decided to step in, and 2018, they actually passed legislature called Work Style Reform Bill to help people feel feel better about taking time off without repercussions, because they were concerned people were not taking time off in fear that that's going to reflect poorly on their performance or assessment by managers or their team. So that legislation was intended to give some flexibility to workers and to cap the excessive number of hours that people were working, and actually gave managers some way to designate people to take time off. So I think that's that's an example of where I think government or companies can actually institute and make changes that could facilitate a shift in a work-life balance.
Now, is that a conversation that we can only have about white-collar professionals? How widespread is this revolution or this change that you're hinting at?
I mean, if you don't mind, I'll tackle that. Just to say that the whole time, like the last minutes we've been talking, I keep thinking about how this is very much a story of an office worker, right? This is a story of someone who mostly works in a setting where like a manager who does a very similar job to them, etc. In our survey, we definitely, when we were asking people about quiet quitting, we received a number of fairly frustrated answers from workers who do work in grocery stores. We have a couple of restaurant workers, and then actually a large number of construction workers, or of sort of that field, where manufacturing, where they're kind of like, this is all kind of a pointless conversation because there's no such thing as clocking out emotionally from my job when my job is to build a building. I do what my manager tells me. And if a similar thing could be said about essential workers like doctors and nurses. When you work in a hospital setting, there isn't really a way for you to calibrate how emotionally or mentally invested you're in your job. You're working with sort of your very focused attention span in your hands. You can't really. So it's definitely a different type of conversation. I do want to say that in the labor world, there are two things that were spurred by the trendy quiet quitting talk. One was, there's obviously a big push and ongoing big push to raise low minimum wages. So minimum wage in the US, officially, formally, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. It hasn't changed in over a decade. And so that's a conversation that's been ongoing, was ongoing during the pandemic, is still ongoing. And then the other thing is the quote unquote crisis of middle management. So sort of a very endemic American thing in the workforce. The middle management really brought forward by the pandemic and the change that the work structure, with it being much more difficult, this world making it much more difficult for middle managers to micromanage, for companies that relied on surveillance of workers in the workplace to continue to do so. All of that really brought to fore that question of like, well, is it me quiet quitting because I can't do my job, or is it me actually my job, in the contrast to unreasonable expectations from middle managers?
Thank you both. If you're just tuning in to our event right now, welcome. This is a conversation on quiet quitting hosted by Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. The organization was created in 2014 and became a nonprofit in 2017. Today, to discuss this conversation with us, this topic of quiet quitting, is Dr. Julie Lee, clinical psychologist, and Alina Silyuk, correspondent at NPR. I would like to turn our attention now to the mental health factors that might be related to quiet quitting. Julie, you've seen in your work how quiet quitting and burnout may engage in a relationship that hasn't surfaced as much in the media yet. Can you tell us more?
Absolutely. I like to share the definition of what the official definition of burnout is. I think all of us could probably have experienced a different degree of burnout at some point in our work life. But official definition that is put up by a World Health Organization is that burnout is a symptom conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has been successfully managed is characterized by three dimensions. One, feeling of energy depletion or exhaustion. Two, increased mental distance from one's job or feeling of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. And third, reduced professional efficacy. So when I revisited and reread that definition, when it alludes to feeling a mental distance from one's job, I couldn't help to wonder how much of what we are seeing and hearing is actually related to people feeling a burnout because of all that we had to manage the last 2.5 years during the pandemic. This is not to discredit or minimize that we're actually thinking, I think, intentionally and reflectively about what's important for us in our work life and in personal life. But I think it's happening in the backdrop of burnout and mental health concerns. We also know that during the pandemic, there has been about 40% increase in anxiety and depression in adult population in the US. And that's, we're talking about diagnosable conditions. If we're talking about stresses and feeling, overwhelmed, those numbers go up to 70 to 80%.
Wow, so really a larger conversation there needed in terms of the differing factors in mental health that may contribute to informing our relationship to work. Alina, I'm curious in your perspective, what you've seen that relates to mental health in work and informing that conversation around quiet quitting.
It's difficult to say. I mean, I focus so much on the economic factors that lead people to change jobs that, the mental health aspect of it is sort of part. And definitely when we talked about the Great Resignation, mental health or just sort of self-preservation was a massive conversation. Resignation, as you might remember, was it 2021, it started in 2021, spilled into this year. And it was driven largely by hospitality and food hospitality, grocery workers, sort of frontline low-wage workers. We talked a lot about really reconsidering the amount of pressure and just like difficult life basically that their work was putting them through. If you think about it, I talked to a home health aide and a restaurant cook, line cook, who both described very different ways just how grueling and mentally draining and physically draining their jobs were. And the pandemic really forced them to look at, this is going to sound really sort of lofty, but it is really like forced them to look at their own mortality and the possibility that they could die doing the work that they were doing, sort of asking themselves, is this what I'm willing to die for? I mean, again, this is not a normal question that a person asks about their job, but the pandemic really forced that question. And because the demands on these workers really increased during the pandemic, that was, driven by, that eventually drove to the Great Resignation. And of course, we keep sort of sorting apart the office workers and the frontline workers. And so I'm not sure how the two correlated, but obviously like these kinds of conversations are contagious. And as people really revisit this idea of, I might die tomorrow of this deadly disease, is this what I'm doing with my life? I think that really spread beyond just the frontline workers.
Agreed. This is something we've heard a lot at Harvard Alumni for Mental Health, right? We've heard people saying, now that I'm confronted to this wave of distress and death around me, really questioning a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and maybe not being satisfied anymore with things that have been okay, or ways to measure success, ways to measure their legacy through their work or their engagement, or is it enough to support my family in this way? And so it's led me to wonder if there's a way in which quiet quitting is good for mental health. Maybe it's about regaining agency in your life choices. Maybe it's about contesting the fact that somebody else is having all the control, and enforcing ways in which you will stop answering email at a certain time, or you will try to enforce certain boundaries in your role, even when you're outside, you know, on a front line, or and not necessarily in an office. Julie, do you see some aspects in which there is a way that quiet quitting is better for mental health, and ways that are perhaps less productive in that sphere?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's a really nuanced one, as we've been saying throughout our conversation. I think because people are approaching and making some decisions about how they work and how engaged they are, it's really difficult to say whether it's positive, negative. I think, for instance, for someone who have been overly invested, perhaps jeopardizing their health, time for leisure, time with their family, in order to meet what they perceive to be a job expectation. Maybe for that segment of population, the idea of really kind of their job objectively, and to say what is it that I'm actually expected and compensated to accomplish, may in fact be a step in gaining a sense of agency. And I think in that way, it could potentially be a positive a step. Having said that, I think it's really also important for us to recognize that I think the research after research shows that most of us, matter of fact, almost all of us, want to be engaged in work that is meaningful. That, you know, while most of us have to work to support ourselves and our loved ones, we want the work that we do, really spending majority of our hours, to be meaningful, something that taps into our strength, our sense of purpose and values, and where we feel we're making a positive contribution. So if people are really stepping back at quiet quitting because they're not finding the work to be engaging and meaningful, then I think the quiet quitting is probably not going to necessarily lead to a better resolution. I think in that case, I think it would be important for individual to really kind of take a stock of what's important for them, what's possible in their current job, what's possible outside of their job, and to sort of try to create a balance. And I want to just obviously, highlight and echo what Olivia was saying previously, that I think in many ways the office workers, we have a little bit more flexibility and options when it comes to being able to negotiate some of these how we engage with work mentally and emotionally compared to who are frontline workers. I do also want to kind of acknowledge that teachers and healthcare workers have also been profoundly impacted during pandemic. I just read an article yesterday about how the shortage of teachers is impacting the classroom experience. So I think we have really seen this trickle down to many different aspects of our sectors.
Thank you, Julie. Alina, I have a bit of a curveball question for you. Why did quiet quitting not happen in the 50s? What was going on, and what type of more global, broad picture changes were we seeing then that we don't see today, or maybe things that we see today that we didn't see at the time?
Well, I'm assuming they didn't have Zoom in the 50s. I'm assuming people weren't expected to check their emails on Saturday morning and just really quickly scan and send over that document.
Yeah.
I mean, I think technology sort of really made work part of our everyday lives in a way that it never had been before. So I think that's the number one change, I feel like. But that's definitely, this sort of comparison to other times like the 30s, the 60s, when the big labor movements were happening, is a big part of the conversations that I've been having related to quiet quitting, because one of the biggest criticisms or sort of the thing that has a lot of labor experts armed is that quiet quitting is sort of like a passive way to go about improving your workplace experience. You're scaling back your own personal experience, your own personal investment, whether it's emotional or actual active, and that doesn't lead to systemic change. If your work is not meaningful, if your manager is terrible, you saying, all right, I'm clocking in at 9, I'm clocking out at 5, I'm doing my job and leaving, doesn't fix the realities of that job. It doesn't improve it. So in the past, where you might have had, really active, intense labor organizing, workplace actions, unionization actions, we're seeing some of that for sure in the workplace, but quiet quitting is sort of not part of that. It's not actively changing the systemic problems with whatever job we're talking about.
I remember discussing this in previous conversations about the fact that perhaps there's been a shift in people's mindset, that they used to trust that in collective action there could be a systemic change, and now we see a lot of the people who are quiet quitting, or even during the Great Resignation, starting their own individual ventures, their own small business, and perhaps turning to, I'm responsible for my own boat, and that's where I put my trust and my faith. Julie, did you see some ways to engage that were more positive, that rely on that individual sense of agency rather than collective?
Absolutely. I actually, when I speak to young professionals, there almost feels like majority of them are asking themselves, what can I as a side hustle or passion project? If my job is going to pay bills and meet my financial need, what can I do outside of work that is actually going to help me to connect with my strength, interest, and values? And also potentially give the financial cushion and avenue to not only supplement the financial income, but I think young professionals are even wondering at some point, can they actually leave their office job and be fully engaged with their entrepreneurial ventures? I think the time will tell, but I think if you look at the number of people who are starting their entrepreneurship and small businesses, I think it's astonishing. Obviously, the internet and online commerce opportunities have made starting one's business incredibly doable and plausible compared to 10, 20 years ago. So I do think that people are really thinking creatively and trying to really take back the sense of agency and control of their financial future and their professional future.
Thank you both. Before we turn to the last topic of today's conversation, I'd like to invite our audience to place your questions in the chat, if you will, or to send it to me as a private message if you would like me to speak it up during the Q&A portion of our event, which will start in just a few minutes. We thought we would finalize this conversation around the question of, where do we take this? What are some actionable recommendations, both at the institutional level that you see a potential for growth coming from the discussion around quiet quitting, and at the individual level, what can individuals do to benefit from this conversation and reinvigorate their relation to work? And I thought I'd share one example here again from my own home country in France, where a new law was passed nationwide. It's called the right to disconnect. And as Alina was saying, right, we didn't used to have this phone call or emails coming on our watches, on our cell phone at late hours at night during the weekend. Well, now in France, it's illegal for your employer to contact you outside of office hours. And it's a way to structurally, as a system, enforce this boundary so that it does not rely on individuals to have to make this boundary and to enforce it in their workplace. I'm curious if both of you can leave us with a few thoughts about places individuals and institutions could go to improve this relation to work.
I could start by maybe giving an example of a client I've been working. He's an executive in a biotech company in Boston, and started to really think about the work-life balance. And he said he works from 8 to 6, take a few hours off to spend time with family. And then starting at 10 o'clock, he has been often working from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. That's been a sort of a routine. And I think during the pandemic and some time off, he realized, boy, I'm really compromising my own health, my sleep, and my time with my family and ability to be really present and engaged, not to mention having time to pursue anything outside of work or family responsibilities. So the conversation, I think at an individual level, I think it's one of the things that I think is really important is for us to take a step back and have a vision about what it is, what has the work has the work been like for us? What has been the impact, both at a personal and kind of a family level, and to sort of ask, does this match in line with, what I aspire in the future? And I think it's really important to ask those questions, because even if it's not immediately possible to change jobs or consider changes within the current job, I think being mindful and intentionally asking those questions help us to identify areas in which where we might actually have more control and agency that we might realize. That brings me to the second recommendation, and that is potentially, if the timing is right, and if you're working with a manager or supervisor is open, is to have a conversation about ways in which job can actually perhaps be shifted. I think one of the things that we know from research is that if people are able to do about 20% of their work that they find creative, that increases their job satisfaction incredibly. Now, 20% be a lot to ask, but I think having an opportunity to take additional work, but doing work within the job description that actually cultivate a sense of contribution and learning new skills, growing professionally within one's job, can potentially help to really increase a sense of engagement and satisfaction. Lastly, I want to say that I just shared the link in the chat with everyone who are interested. That has a list of values that was put up by Brene Brown. It's a tough exercise, but we often ask people to identify two out of that list, and it's a difficult task because most of those values are very positive and ones that we tend to endorse. But if we could really narrow down to two values that are important related to our work, and be intentionally thinking about, can I actually incorporate and pursue some of these values and integrate them to in our work life, it could be a helpful exercise.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this exercise. We'll make sure to post the resources as well with the video on our YouTube channel. Alina, what about you? Recommendations for our audience?
The experts I've talked to sort of like almost universally will talk about improved manager training. It's a sort of thing that, an individual worker cannot, force their manager to undergo, but sort of structurally that, to go back to what Julie was saying, 70% of workers, their entire work experience essentially shaped by their direct manager. And the middle management is often sort of where the problems are, the gaps are, where people jump into management first time. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I just wanted to give a really big caveat that individual conversations with bosses are what most people will say, that like you just have to take proactive action and have a conversation with your boss or your boss's boss, and like make sure you know what it is you want from your job and see if they give it to you. These conversations are not possible for a lot of people. I know from experience, especially women in the workplace, especially if their boss is women of color in the workplace, especially if their boss is white male. These conversations get very tricky very quickly. And so it's sort of easy advice to give, not always plausible advice to follow. And then the third thing I wanted to say is that Anna Huffington, who is a huge opponent of quiet quitting, she was mortified by this concept. She pointed out something like to her, she was saying that really almost sort of sad and heartbreaking that somebody would spend so much of their life doing something they actively dislike. And her advice was to just find a better job. And until now, for right now too, like that is dynamic that is happening a lot. As I pointed out, people are quitting their jobs in droves. And in this moment in time, there are almost twice as many job openings as workers. So the power dynamic is in the workers' favor. So the possibility of even upgrade from a low wage job to a higher wage job, employers are being a bit more flexible with prerequisites and requirements for various jobs, seeking better candidates to, rushing to fill position. So that is, that is still a possibility at the moment, but it's also such individual advice that not everyone can do it.
Absolutely. Thank you both for this rich conversation. I'd love to turn to our audience. I know that I've seen already some questions in the chat. Feel free to write your questions. I'm going to take the first one here that tailgates perfectly with what you finished on, Alina, which is, thank you for this insightful conversation. I'm wondering if quiet quitting is a kind of fashion contagion, which is going to end with the looming recession.
I was mindful of the question. I didn't want to answer it too far before you asked it. But that's definitely, sort of the ebb and flow of the power dynamics in the workforce have so much to do with unemployment levels. And right now in this inflationary period, we are coming off of 2 years of just really skewed, more jobs available than workers being interested in them. So work really taking preference, choosing jobs that are better for them, choosing jobs, better benefits and pay, upgrading jobs. Now the inflationary period, that is raising interest rates, et cetera, the expectation is that potentially we're going to see a tight workplace. So some jobs will be lost, there might be job cuts. And if all of that does play out, right, the power dynamic tightens again, and we'll be having a very different conversation about, how easy it is for you to quit your dead-end job and find a better one, which is sort of the conversation that a lot of workers have been having just amongst themselves for the past 2 years.
Thank you, Lena. Julia, did you want to take this one as well, or do you want the next question? I got a question for you next.
Yeah, maybe we should go to the next one in the interest of time.
Great. The next one has to do with going from quiet quitting to quiet firing. Do you think there is a risk there, and to what extent can employers kind of retaliate after somebody quiet quits?
Yeah. Again, a sort of a related topic here. How will sort of this phenomenon, be impacted by evolving the market forces and the inflation? I think it's time will tell, and I think certainly people will be prioritizing the financial security, having a job. At the same time, I'm inclined to think that the questions that we've been mentioning all along, that question about what's meaningful, how do we prioritize our wellness, how do we have work experience that is personally and professionally aligned with how we want to be and how we want to contribute to the society, I think it's going to linger. And also the question about the wellness, I think we're prioritizing, certainly we hear often from Gen Zs and young millennials, like their sense of the wellness defined very broadly, both mental health, but physical health, and having a balance between work and personal life. I believe those questions and shift in values is going to continue to impact our engagement in races in some way.
Thank you, Julie. We value your feedback, and people in the audience, if you want to take a minute to answer the survey that's on your screen as our panelists are continuing to answer your question. The next question is for both of you. Both Dr. Lee and Alina have touched about the ineffectiveness of individuals not making systemic changes. Are there policies in the U.S. Pipeline to protect U.S. workers that you know of?
Policies in the US many, many years to play out. So I don't have sort of a very clear and satisfying direct answer to that question. So the real answer is I don't really. But I can tell you that what I've been following is unionization laws, which is, sort of adjacent to that sort of worker empowerment conversation. And the worker unionization laws have been watered down over the past decades. And so now there's definitely a much stronger conversation within the labor organizing community about trying to turn them over. They're lobbying the government, as they have for many years, to try to change that, but they're lobbying in sort of in contrast to companies that are obviously are lobbying to keep them tight, to keep that, as they call, direct relationship with workers rather than unions. So these types of negotiations take many, many years to play out. And I'm not going to say that that's going to change anytime soon.
Thank you, Alina. Julie, final words? You're agreeing?
Yes.
All right, well then perhaps we have time for one last question. What types of wellness resources for the workplace are research and anecdotal data showing are most valued? And that will be our last question for today's event.
Yeah. Great question. And I'm glad that we're actually circling back to the question about wellness, which is so important. I think the workers, all of us, are actually demanding and requesting the resources. The recent survey that was completed by Deloitte consulting firm, when surveying thousands of workers, one of the top the request and expectation was increasing resources related to health. So people, we used to be satisfied with just having a insurance coverage, mental health, but now people are saying that's not enough. I think some of you be working for an organization where they have boosted and augmented their mental support by having a technology-driven EAP, employment assistance program. Some of those larger companies include Ginger, Lyra, and Modern Health. And I think about a good percentage of the Fortune 500 companies have actually added those benefits. But on the last note, I'd like to that what has really, the research has shown that when employees a sense of agency and ability to advocate for their needs, that really has a significant impact in how they feel about being in the workplace. I do agree with Alina that is, that's not always possible, but I think people are organizing within the group. I think employment affinity groups are becoming more active. I think some of the human resource people are, personnel are becoming cognizant of fact that the peer support is important and people want to advocate collectively, not individually.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. We all really benefited from your thoughts on quiet quitting. If you enjoyed our panel today, we would love to have you become more involved with Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. I have added the link in the chat. And please note that Harvard Alumni for Mental Health is a nonprofit organization. We are glad that we can keep our events free and open to the public. If you would like to donate to support us in this mission, we would really appreciate it. And the link is in the chat. Once again, Dr. Lee, Alina Saluk, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day.